Welcome to this week's Read the Bible Together session. And we are continuing our Old Testament series. We are continuing in Exodus. This one is chapter 7, verse 14 through chapter 12, verse 32. It is a rather long reading. It is familiar, and it is the foundation for what brings us to Easter. So, from the Spark Story Bible from Spark House Publishing, we will read the plagues. God gave Moses a big job. Moses had to stand up to a very stubborn king who was making God's people work as slaves. God told Moses to go to the Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh said, "No, I will not let God's people go." Pharaoh wanted the people to worship him, not God. So God used 10 ways, called plagues, to change Pharaoh's mind. God turned the Nile to blood. The river began to stink. Pharaoh watched the river turn red and knew his people could not drink. And the Pharaoh still said no. God sent frogs to hop everywhere, even into the beds. And Pharaoh heard his bakers scream when frogs jumped out of their breads. And Pharaoh still said, "No." You can see, there you go, the frogs jumping everywhere. Can you imagine? And then God thought gnats might change Pharaoh's mind so the people could go free. And gnats swarmed to the people and the goats and the cows. There was no place to flee. And Pharaoh still said no. Flies, thought God, will do the trick. So God sent a zillion, and Pharaoh's house filled up with flies, and outside there were 1,000,000. And Pharaoh still said no. And God struck down Pharaoh's herds, and the camels were all ill, and the donkeys and the horses all got sick. His cows fell down, but still Pharaoh said no. And then oozy, gooey, icky sores on everybody's skin. God knocked and knocked on Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh never let God in. And Pharaoh still said no. And then hail pounded, thunder crashed, and Pharaoh's plants laid it down. Not a tree stood anymore. All were on the ground, and Pharaoh still said no. And there you can see the lightning and the hail, all these storms and bugs, plagues, right? Pharaoh was still saying no. "Let my people go," said God, "or I will send a swarm of locusts to devour what's left. To your land, it will do more harm." And Pharaoh still said no. Now darkness covered Pharaoh's land, and the sun did not appear. No one could move, no one could see. Pharaoh would not hear, and Pharaoh still said no. This last and saddest plague of all brought sobs throughout the land. Parents cried as their children died, and finally Pharaoh changed his plans, and Pharaoh let God's people go. And there you can see the darkness that covered the land. But Pharaoh did change his mind and let God's people go. And we will pick the story up from there next week.